Good morning, everyone. I finally figured out how to get taller. So you've all had this weekly summer series on Chesed. It's a tremendous undertaking, and I want to thank Whit for putting together something like this. The truth of the matter is we spend so much time understanding the difficult nekudos of Shabbos and so much time understanding kashrus, and we don't spend enough time on Chesed. And by the time we're finished here today, I hope everyone understands that while all the mitzvahs are important and they all have pratim and details which are worthy of study, that if you don't get the element of Chesed, you've kind of gotten the frosting without the cake. So we're going to start off today with a little bit the topic that we called our discussion today, and I want it to be a discussion, really. If anyone has anything to say, please chime in, ask a question, and we'll be happy to discuss it. I find that people get more things out of things if it's a two-way street. But our topic today is called How and Why Chesed Pulses Through Our Veins. And that's not a catchy title, but Chesed really does run through us. And the question is why? Everybody knows it, right? We all feel good when we do something good. We all even have the impetus to do something good, right? We want to. Who wakes up in the morning and says, I want to kick a dog? Nobody does that, right? We all wake up and say, what can I do to make myself feel good because I'm doing Chesed? It's something that we do for ourselves as well as for other people. What is it about Chesed? Why does it pulse through our veins? Did you all get the source sheets? If you want to follow along with them, I will refer to them, but it's not necessary. The first source sheet is one that, for those of you who have been in any of my discussions before, is one I'm fond of using, but it's directly relevant as a head topic for what we're talking about today. It's actually part of the Shulchan Aruch. For those of you who don't know, the Shulchan Aruch is our code of Jewish law. It's one of the two masterpieces which have codified every aspect of Jewish law from the Torah and the Talmud. The other being the Rambam's Yad Chazaka. But the Shulchan Aruch discusses every aspect of how to whether you can milk a cow at certain hours, and how long, if that gets mixed with flakes, how long would it be tregged for, and how do you kosher things? Every intricate detail you can imagine. If someone borrows money, how long do they have to pay back if it wasn't specified? The Shulchan Aruch is just a comprehensive discussion of Torah law. There's nothing in Torah law that you can't find that isn't either in the Shulchan Aruch or the Rambam. So on certain topics that we spend much time talking about, whether it's for yourself or for your daughters or for your granddaughters or for your sons or your grandsons, one of them is how to find someone who's qualified to marry, right? Spend all that time. Is it they should be learning every day, they should be a mensch, all these different things that we hear as part of the criteria for someone that we should marry. But very few people refer to the Shulchan Aruch, which is kind of surprising because Shulchan Aruch is where we get all of our halachos from. And you would think on a topic so important that the Shulchan Aruch would devote 20, 30 pages to the details of how to find the proper person and how to make sure that they're the kind of person you want to marry. So the first source sheet which I gave you devotes the entire contents of the Shulchan Aruch on the topic. It's about 6 lines, is what the Shulchan Aruch tells us on how someone should find a spouse. And it starts off, you see where the lines get wide, in the middle section where the lines get wide, it's about 4 lines down. And the Shulchan Aruch is dealing with a question that the Gemara deals with. The Gemara wants to know if you're dating someone, thinking of marrying them, how do you know they're Jewish? Right? Because the Shulchan Aruch's axiom that it starts with is that the most important thing is to marry a Jew. Well, we're all advanced Jews, we don't need to be told that. But the Shulchan Aruch thought it was important. Axiomatic, you have to marry someone who's Jewish. So the Shulchan Aruch discusses a question which is raised in the Gemara that, there's no identification papers today. How do you know if someone's Jewish? Maybe they even think they're Jewish and they're not. How do you know? So the Shulchan Aruch says, HaMishpachos b'chazaka kashrus u'mutar lisa mehem lechatchila. Everyone starts with an assumption that if they act like a Jew and claim to be Jewish, that they're Jewish. You don't have to do a background check. You don't have to hire the FBI or a private detective to find out if their great-great-grandparents were pretending to be Jewish because it was meritorious for them or would get them a better job somewhere. You're allowed to assume that if someone claims to be Jewish and someone acts like they're Jewish, that they're Jewish. That's the first halacha in the Shulchan Aruch about how to find a spouse. And then 3 lines later, and you'll see this is about 4 lines from the bottom of the middle section of the long lines, where there's a dalet at the beginning of the line. It says, however, the az panim biyoser, if someone has a frowning face constantly, choshinan lahem, then you should be a little bit suspect. It's just not a Jewish quality. Jews don't walk around with a constantly sad face. V'roy l'israchek mehem, and it's worthy to stay away from people like that. She'ilu simoni psulus, these are signs that someone may not be a Jew. And now go down to the last, second to last line where there's a hey at the beginning of a line, and this is really the kicker. V'chein mi sheyesh bo azos panim, he again refers to this negative type of face, v'achzarius, or they're people that are disgusting. The sonei sabrios, they hate God's creations. That's the kicking the dog again. Ve'eno gomel lachem chesed, and they don't do chesed. Choshinan lo biyoser. Those people you have to suspect greatly. And if you look down at the bottom, there was 3 lines from the absolute bottom of the page. It says, V'achzarius, to gimel simonim yesh b'Yisrael. There's 3 signs of a Jew. Yeshenim, they're sweet people. Rachmanim, they're merciful people. L'gomle chesed, and they do chesed. It is who we are. And if we're not doing it every day, it's because there's something wrong with us. We must have been dropped as a child or something. It is who we are. In order for us not to be like that, we have to deactivate the program. Like anything else, you can shut it off, but it's in us. It's who we are, and it always has been. What I'm going to talk about today with you, though, is how did this happen? Why did this happen? Of all the different midos we could have, why chesed? Why is it the cornerstone of who we are? So the answer, like everything else, comes in our Torah. The Torah starts with chesed, and it ends with chesed. How does the Torah start with chesed? It's not just a catchy phrase. Does anyone know why do we say the Torah starts with chesed? Go ahead.
I heard one speaker here this summer say that it was a chesed of giving Adam and Eve their clothing, even though they sinned. And then today we heard that Avram Avinu did the Mayim.
These summer sessions are great. That is one of the answers which I was going to talk about. That's exactly right, though. The Torah starts off with Hashem giving clothing to Adam and Chava. Now let's explore that for a minute. Adam and Chava didn't need clothing when they were first created. They weren't even aware that there was any reason to wear clothing. The only need for clothing came because why? Because when they committed their chet, they became more knowledgeable of certain things, were on a lower madrega, and all of a sudden they had this need for clothing. Now you would think, Hashem's going to say, you just committed an Aveira, and because of your Aveira, now I should take care of you? You brought this on yourself, right? Then again, I guess that's akin to you tell your child not to climb on the monkey bars without being careful, and they fall down and scrape their knee. You say, I'm not giving you a Band-Aid, I told you not to do that. That's not the way we do things. You give the child a Band-Aid, and you try to remind them that that's not a smart thing to do. And that's what Hashem did. But nevertheless, it starts with chesed, because that's who we are. And Hashem clothed Adam and Chava when they had a need. He didn't explore why they had a need, or whether they had brought it on themselves. How does the Torah end with chesed?
The way Moshe Rabbeinu was buried?
Exactly. Moshe Rabbeinu was too kadosh for people to bury him. Hashem did not want anyone to know his burial site. So Hashem buried him himself. And we know that Meis Mitzvah, the mitzvah of burying someone, is one of the true chasadim in the world, because you can't expect repayment. I'm sorry, did you have a question before?
Yes.
Yeah.
So my question is, the way I probably don't understand it well, but it seems to me when Hashem created man, creating the world, all this beautiful stuff in the world was an act of chesed.
I think that's true. We're actually going to talk about that a little bit in a little bit, but I think that's an excellent point. She's saying that the very act of creating the world was an act of chesed. And that is something we're going to talk about in a little bit. It actually started, like you said, way before that. Hashem created this world. It's very popular since the 1950s and 60s, when science started really permeating these school curriculums with regard to creationism versus evolution and things of that nature, when Darwinism was accepted as a fact as opposed to a theory, that many of the people of Torah knowledge kind of ran away from the idea of the Big Bang. Because many people use the Big Bang as a way of explaining how the world was created or how the world began. And many secular scientists use the Big Bang to say the world started by itself. Because there was a proton, an electron, and an atom, and whatever, all these terms I don't understand, and they bumped into each other, and from there, everything was created. Of course, the only problem with that is they don't explain how the proton got there in the first place, how the electron got there in the first place, and how the atom got there in the first place, but they'll leave that for another day. At least they're satisfied that they can explain how the cosmos and the galaxies were created. And for some reason, Torah people, they're not comfortable with this, probably because many of them don't have a scientific background. They're not comfortable with the idea that there could be a Big Bang. They want to just believe that Hashem just created the world just like it says in Bereshis. And that's fine, because that is how the world was created. But it never occurs to many of those people that the two are actually harmonious. And there's all types of svarim and books that have been written on how the first 5 days of creation really mirror the first 14 billion years that the world was in existence from the explosion of the Big Bang. But I don't want to get into all that today. What I do want to get into is the Gemara talks about why the world was created. Why did Hashem decide to create the world? We know that Hashem existed forever. We know that Hashem has no needs, as we call them, and He has no wants, as we call them. And many people who have struggled with the topic, the reason they struggle is because they can't deal with using those words that Hashem had a need or Hashem had a want, because they're inconsistent with their idea of what Hashem is. So the explanation that seems to me to make the most sense is brought down in some of the deeper thinking svarim, and they say that compare it to a beaker with a top on it. You have a beaker full of water. Does anybody here have any kind of scientific background? Okay, so if you have a beaker full of water and you cover it and seal it and you heat it up, the water becomes hotter and hotter. If you keep heating it up, what happens? Eventually it's going to explode because it can't be contained. And that is Hashem's goodness. Hashem is the quintessential, concentrated form of goodness. And at some point, it just, boom! And that chesed can't be contained anymore. So Hashem's by himself in a non-world that has no one or nothing for him to do chesed to. He had no need, he had no want. But there's an uncontrollable force that there's an uncontrollable force of chesed. And when it can't be contained anymore because there's no outlet, the box is sealed, it explodes. That explosion is our Big Bang. Whatever you want to say the scientific words are, whatever the comparisons are between our physical Big Bang and any spiritual world that parallels it is really not relevant. But to understand that the Gemara says Hashem created the world out of chesed. That's what He created it out of. So we know that chesed is who we are. But I wanted to take a few minutes to explore what that means through the psukim in the Torah. If you turn to your second source sheet, there's a few psukim there, and I apologize because at my advanced age I can't read all the small print anymore, but we'll struggle through it. Let me ask you a question. Which one of the avos is synonymous with chesed? By this time everyone's heard this, right? Abraham. What was Abraham's great act of chesed? I can't hear you, I'm sorry? Greeting the three strangers that came to meet him after the bris milah. Nice story, right? Is that the greatest example of chesed that we have in the Torah? Not even close. I mean, we could literally go through probably half the parshios in the Torah and find examples of chesedim which on their surface appear greater than that. But that's really one of the only two stories about Abraham. The other one's more implied, and we'll talk about it in a minute. That examples his chesed. Let's look at some of the other tremendous examples of chesed. We already talked about Hashem giving clothing to Adam and Chava, even though they were responsible for their own need for it. So the first source on the top of the page is the pasuk in Noach. And on the second line, towards the end, it says, Vayimochu min haaretz vayishaer ach Noach v'asher ito b'teva. Ach Noach, that last line, literally means Noach was alone. Many Mefarshim write on this unusual expression of who Noach was. There's other way of saying Noach bilvad, whatever it is, but Ach Noach is an unusual expression. So if you look at the Rashi next to it, the top line says Ach Noach levad mazab pshuto. That's what it means. Noach zeb pshuto. He was alone. That's the simple translations of the words. Umedrasha aguda. It says damu taras habehemus v'achayas. He was coughing and spitting blood from all of his aggravation with taking care of the animals. And then if you read a little further, after the Gemara in Sanhedrin, it says, the second line from the bottom of the Rashi, it says, V'yesh omrim she'ichar mazonos le'ari. He was late bringing dinner to the lion one night. V'yichishu alav. And he maimed him. Now, take a minute for a second. Noach has been told that he is going to be saved because of all the people in the world, he's the only one who's righteous. Noach, your reward for being righteous is that for the next year, you get to be a human pooper scooper. You get to follow all these animals around, not only taking care of their dietary needs, but taking care of their sanitary needs, dealing with all their different temperaments that they have, dealing with the fact that they're much larger than you are, that they're not used to being in a confined space. Noach, you've truly earned this. And Noach did this diligently, didn't complain about it. Not only didn't complain about it, but according to Rashi, he suffered physical damage because of it. That's a tremendous amount of self-sacrifice, and probably one of the reasons why Noach was the type of person that was worthy to be saved. Yet, we don't hear ever that Noach is the paramount example of Chesed. Go down to the next source, and it says at the end of the first line, Vayelech Avraham kasher diberi lov. Hashem had told him to go out. Vayelech ito Lot. And Lot went with him. Who invited Lot? It wasn't customary in those days for families really to stick together. Husbands and wives stayed together. Maybe parents with small children stayed together, but Lot wasn't a small child at this point. Why did Lot go with him? Why was Lot invited to go with him? So again, the Mefarshim explain that Lot's father was killed in the Kivshon when he had tried to go in following Avraham, and he was an orphan. And even though he's an orphan that's already an adult and self-sufficient and taking care of himself, Avraham couldn't leave an orphan behind in a world that was already hostile to those people that recognized Hashem. So he took him with him. We don't use that example from Avram Avinu as a sign of his greatness in Chesed. Go to the third source. This is in Sodom, when Lot, at risk of the death penalty, which is what the penalty was in Sodom for having guests, Lot took in these two strangers into his house. Now understand, Sodom wasn't a place where you had a multitude of appeals, and you weren't going to have the ACLU championing on your behalf that cruel and unusual punishment. If they found you had guests, they were going to kill you. So Lot took in these guests. We don't hear that Lot was somehow a great example of Machnise Orchim. We do hear in one Rashi that he learned this midah from Avraham and from living in his house. But we don't hear that Lot exemplified this midah on some grand scale, even though he did. And to what extreme? Look at this pasuk in the third source. They want to take these two men because Sodom was an immoral place. And when guests came to town, they wanted to take advantage of these guests. He says, no, please don't bother my guests. Hinei nali shtei banos. I have two daughters. Okay, misguided as that may be, depraved as it may be, but to the extent that he's sacrificing his own family to protect guests, it's still a tremendous example of Machnise Orchim, even if it's demented and twisted. And it goes further, even to the last line on that source, which says, Rak lo anashim ha'el al tasu davar. But to these men, don't do anything. Because his guests were people that were under his roof, he felt responsible for them. His daughters were already adults, I don't get it, but that's not the point. The point is that it was a tremendous example of trying to protect guests. And I want to start off by mixing in with these psukim certain really, truly exceptional stories of Chesed, which have come to my attention. All of these are true stories. Some of them have a Baltimore connection. But this story with Lot, really, I think, is parallel to one of them. I heard this story just recently, and I'm sorry if any of you have heard any of these stories before, but I'm sure somewhere through the day there'll be one or two that you haven't heard. There is a storekeeper in Eretz Yisrael, not particularly religious, and a young girl, 3 to 4 years old, is in his store crying. And she's crying for her mother, who she can't find, and she's very upset. She's lost. And the storekeeper tries to ask her, who are you, who's your mother, whatever, and after 20, 30 seconds, the frantic mother comes running into the store. Have you seen my daughter? Daughter and mother are reunited, but the storekeeper cannot help but notice that the daughter not only was wearing tremendously tattered and disheveled clothing, but so was her mother. And it was obvious these were people of very little means. And the storekeeper took it upon himself to take new clothing off the rack for both of them, and to give them new clothing so they'd look nice, and some other clothing to take home. And the mother did not know from where this kindness was coming, but she certainly was in no position to say no. And she accepted these clothes as gifts. And he says, listen, I don't think this was a chance encounter. I'd like to maintain a connection with your family. And he arranged to provide them a monthly stipend of money to help them live a more positive life. And this went on for many years, until this young girl, who was 3, 4 years old, was getting married. And again, there's never been any discussion as to why this person undertook this, but rather there was people that were in need, and he did this, and they accepted the charity very appreciatively, but they never talked to him about where or why. And when the girl became engaged to be married, this man was already like an uncle figure in their family. They knew that every month this man would give them some money. They didn't really socialize together or anything like that, but there was obviously a connection in the family between them. And this man said to the girl upon getting married, I'm going to carry this tradition through to you and your husband and your family, just to give you some extra money so that you'll have some things that maybe you otherwise couldn't afford. Now, this kind of strange relationship continued until the husband of this young girl said, who is this strange man who's giving us money? And the girl said, I really don't know, but he's been giving our family money for a very long time. He's like a quasi-relative. He's like an uncle. So, that's what he does. And the husband thought it was very, very strange, very suspicious. What was the motives of this man? And he went to meet this person. And the person said, listen, it's just something that I've always done, and I like to do it. And the husband was satisfied that he was doing it out of a genuine kindness, but he said to him, listen, it's an amazing thing that you've done all these years, but I have a good job. We really don't need your kindness, and maybe there's other people who could benefit from it more, but whatever it is, you've done this till now at great self-sacrifice. We don't need the charity anymore, at least our part of the family doesn't. And the storekeeper reluctantly agreed to stop. And the next day, his store was shot, he was robbed, and he was shot and killed. Terrible story. I know my wife told me not to tell you. But here's what happened. The storekeeper confided to the husband the reason why he had started giving this family help. Because 15 years earlier, when this young girl was in his store, she was in his store an hour after an attempted robbery. And the robber had a gun to his head and was going to kill him when some little old man with a long beard walked in and spooked the robber, and the robber ran away. And he was literally about to pull the trigger. And the storekeeper said to this little old man, who are you? How did you scare off the attacker? He says, I didn't do anything. He said, the tremendous acts of generosity and kindness which you did scared him away. He says, I haven't done any tremendous acts of generosity or kindness. You will. And an hour later, this young girl walked into my store, and I realized it was a sign that this was the family that I was supposed to take care of, and it was the reason why my life was spared. And again, it's a terrible ending that when he stopped doing the chesed, his life ended. but the lesson's so valuable. We don't realize how one act of chesed that we haven't even done yet can change the world. Sometimes the only reason we're here is for one thing that we're going to do. And there's no past, present, or future in God's book. It doesn't matter if we're 5 or if we're 50 or 150. The time is now. And we never know which moment in our lives is that time that we could make all the difference to justify our continued being here and our being here now. And I want to tell you one more story now before we go on to the rest of the sources. I hesitate to tell you this story now because it's so powerful it's distracting. This is a true story which happened here in Baltimore. I may have some of the details a little bit wrong, but I've heard several versions of it, but the general story is the same. There was a young man in the community, a teenage boy, who had been diagnosed with a very serious illness. And although the illness was life-threatening, there was a form of treatment which could save him. It involved a blood transfusion. And like you may hear sometimes in the shuls or the Where, What, When or other places, that sometimes they have blood drives or matching donations or things like that to see if you're a blood type match for a certain person that needs a transfusion. And they actually have a national database on this now for Jewish people and secular people, because obviously if you're a Jewish person of a certain descent, you're more likely to find a match of someone of similar descent. But the first place they look is usually family, because within the same family you're much more likely to have a match. Fortunately for this teenage boy, his younger sister was a match. And again, I don't know whether she was 6 or whether she was 8 at the time, but the age isn't really important. But she was an exact match. And so the family, being Torah-observant Jews, asked their Rav, well, what's the process now? Do we just strap her to a table and tell her we're taking some of her bone marrow? Do we have to get her consent? I mean, how does this work? And the Rav explained to them that, listen, you should obviously get her consent, explain to her what's going on, and if you need to, bribe her with stuffed animals, toys, presents, whatever it is, to get her consent. But obviously, even though she's a child, you should get her consent before subjecting her to a procedure. There's no life-threatening procedure to her, but you are taking her blood, you're causing some discomfort, whatever it is. You don't have the right to do that just arbitrarily. You should get her consent. So the parents sat down with the daughter and explained to them the tremendous danger that her older brother was in. And they said, the fact of the matter is, though, the doctors have determined that your blood has within it what needs to be used to save him. And we want to make sure it's okay with you. We want to ask you for your permission to donate your blood to your brother to save him. And the girl thought about it for a moment, and after a few seconds she said, okay, I'm willing. The preparations began being made, and apparently the way they do this, they have both the donor and the donee in one hospital room, and there's lines drawn from here, and it goes through filters and this and that, until eventually it goes into the boy, and he's receiving the donation that he needs. And the girl had a couple of weeks to think about this while the preparations were being made, and nevertheless, she's at the hospital with her parents, ready to go through, and she's lying down on the bed, and the doctor's about to put the first needle in to her arm to connect her to the transfusion machine. And says, do you have any questions before we begin? She says, no. She says, I do have one question. She says, sure. Am I going to begin to die right away? And they didn't understand what she meant until they didn't realize that her perception of this procedure was that the blood would be drained from her body and given to her brother. That's chesed. Well, we throw around a term like chesed like it's, some common tennis ball. But in the eyes and the mind of a pure child who hadn't learned how yet to turn off the switch, that's literally what it means to have chesed pulsing through your veins. I know it's a distracting story, but we have to move on and try to figure out this enigma of chesed. What is it still? We know it when we see it, but what is it? It's an enigma. Go to the next source in your source sheet, And we have another tremendous example of chesed. This is the one from Parshas Vayetze, second one from the bottom. And this is when Eliezer comes to Rivka and says, "Can I have some water to drink?" And Rivka responds, "Vatomer gam l'gmalecha esav." I'm going to get for your camels also. Okay, nice story. Not only going to get water for you, I'm going to get for your camels. Just go over to the tap, fill up a big bucket. Didn't work like that. Getting water was a big deal. It was work that was usually reserved for some of the strong men in the community. There's all types of explanations given for why Rivka was doing it. But nevertheless, there was a lot of manual labor involved here. Pumping it out of the well, and enough for camels? Everybody knows since second grade how much camels drink. This is a lot of work. This is a day's undertaking to feed all these camels. Of course, Rivka had nothing else to do. But yet, we don't hear Rivka held up as an example of chesed. We do hear that when she came to Sarah's tent, the simanim returned, and the food remained fresh from week to week, and all the other things that were brachos from Sarah's time. But we don't hear of Rivka's tremendous chesed. We do hear of her tznius and the way she sat on the camel, but nothing about Rivka's tremendous chesed. Yet, the Torah's recitation of her chesed, again, seems to eclipse Abraham's. Why isn't Rivka held up as the paramount for chesed? Each one of these sukkim, each one of these stories, reflects a part of the midah of chesed. This story with Rivka is somewhat different than the other ones. And let's try to explain how. Part of chesed is not only doing something nice, kind, or good, but it's going the extra mile. Maybe doing it when it wasn't warranted, maybe doing more than was immediately necessary, maybe thinking for tomorrow, maybe thinking beyond the immediate needs of the person. And for this, I want to tell you our third story. Many people here are old enough to remember some of the World War II issues personally. Others have heard it from their parents or grandparents. But there's so many different stories. Rabbi Hauer went into a multitude of them on Tisha B'Av. There's so many stories about survival for those people who were lucky enough to get out. But there was one story of a small yeshiva of about 27 people altogether. And they were in an area where the Germans were not occupying yet, but rather they were coming in and taking over. And they would find out who the organizers were in the city, who the important people were in the city, and every day they would come for a few more. So the 27 had dwindled to 12. The other ones had been taken and disappeared. It wasn't like they had the option to just run away. Where were they going to go? In order to get out, you needed an exit visa, which some of them could actually get either through bribery or other means, but that wasn't enough. You needed an entrance visa to somewhere else. So when it became word that two specific boys were next, they managed to get exit visas for them, but they had nowhere to go. They applied for an entrance visa to another country. The only problem is it takes 48 hours to get a response. 48 hours from now, they were already going to be gone. So they got on a train, knowing that when they got to their destination, they'd have to wait probably 36 hours to find out if they were going to be permitted to leave, whether the entrance visa had come through. Imagine they're sitting in the train station, waiting, wondering if that visa is going to come through, knowing that 36 hours from now there's a train leaving, but they don't know if they can get on it. A few minutes after they left, word came that the visas were granted. The boys didn't know it, and they're traveling on the train for the next 12 hours, unbeknownst whether they'd be taken into custody or whether they'd be able to leave the country with an entrance visa to someplace else. So their Rosh Yeshiva got on the next train to follow them, to tell them that their entrance visas had been granted. And he got to the bus station a few hours after them. So they had a 12-hour trip, he had a 12-hour trip, but he was 3 to 4 hours behind them. And they told them, he says, I just want you to know, your entrance visas have been granted. You're going to be able to leave. I said, That's fantastic, but why did you travel here to tell us? That's the whole point, is that we're going to be able to know everything was okay. Why did you need to travel? Couldn't let you sit in this train station for the next 30 hours wondering if you were going to be permitted to leave. That wasn't what it was all about. It was all about getting out. It was all about whether they'd get the entrance visa. But this man understood that even though their lives were going to be saved, even though they were going to be getting out, that for the next 30 hours they'd be suffering in a train station wondering if that entrance visa was granted. And it was unfathomable to him to allow these two boys to sit and suffer like that when he could make it a shorter amount of time. That's the example of Rivka with the camels. That's what it means when we're talking about true chesed. It's not just about taking care of the immediate need. The immediate need is that their lives are being saved. But beyond the immediate need, it's the fact that there was still 30 hours of unnecessary suffering, of anguish. For what? That could be still prevented. So he hopped on a train to prevent those 30 hours of anguish. That's a big deal. And that's another part of the element of chesed. The going the extra mile. And then we get to our bottom source from the Chumash, just through Sefer Bereshis, of examples of chesed. And this one probably trumps them all. This is from the parsha with Leah and Rachel marrying Yaakov Avinu. Leah and Rachel marrying Yaakov Avinu. And we all know the story that Yaakov had contracted to marry Rachel, but Leah was substituted in her place. And the pasuk says, "Vayhi baboker v'hinei hi Leah." He woke up in the morning and oh my gosh, it's Leah here. So Rashi says, right next to it, if you look, the last word of the line, first line, Avu balayla lo haisa Leah. What do you mean by hi baboker? It was Leah. At night it wasn't Leah? He goes, it was. He says what it means when it says v'hinei hi Leah, it means Lefi sheyomer Yaakov Simonim l'Rachel. Yaakov gave Simonim over to Rachel. Ukesharo Rachel shemachnisin lo so Leah. When Rachel saw that they were preparing Leah to marry Yaakov, Amra Achshav, I can't read, I'm sorry, the Prince Jews, Mohachlo Machosai Amodav Amra lo osan Simonim. My sister would be embarrassed when Yaakov protested that he wasn't intending to marry Leah, so Rachel gave her the Simonim. That's a nice gesture, right? She didn't want her sister to be embarrassed. Really? Is that all we're talking about? She didn't want her sister to be embarrassed? Think about this for a second. Rachel knew she was intended to marry Yaakov. Yaakov wanted to marry her. They're preparing to get married. Instead, she gives the simanim to her sister, that her sister becomes Yaakov's wife. Rachel had no idea that she would be a second wife. She had no idea that Yaakov would ever marry her now after this. She was giving up her husband. Not so her sister would have a husband. She was giving up her husband so her sister wouldn't suffer some embarrassment. Forever, written out of the book. Not being a mother to any of the Shvatim. That's what she's giving up. Yet, we don't hear Rachel held up as the paramount example of chesed. But Rachel, nevertheless, teaches us another part of what chesed is. Because if we can never define it, we can at least understand certain parts of it. Until we get to the final biblical source of chesed that I want to mention today. It's not on your source sheets, but it's in Megillas Rus. Rus is a phenomenal Megillah we can learn so much from, so much is talked about it. What really isn't emphasized enough in Megillas Rus, though, is the chesed. What did Rus do at the beginning of the Megillah? She decides to go with Naomi back to Klal Yisrael. Rus wasn't Jewish. Rus was Moab. And what was the rule? No one from Moab could marry into Bnei Yisrael. Just out on the side, where did that rule come from? Why such a rule about Ammon and Moab not being allowed to marry Jews? We married Egyptians. We married all kinds of people. There was no kinds of rules. Where did this rule come from? that Ammon and Moab, of all the wicked people in the world, they couldn't marry into Bnei Israel. We had all types of, the Avos who didn't want people from the Benos Canaan, but it wasn't a rule, it was a custom, it was a practice. But there was a rule about Moab and Ammon. They couldn't marry the Jews. Where did that come from? Go ahead.
They wouldn't offer us water when we had passed through their lands.
That's exactly right. We were passing through the Midbar. Not only wouldn't they offer us food, they wouldn't even sell us food. And that example of not being willing to offer food to someone was considered, as we talked about at the beginning in the Even Ezra, a psul. It was a sign that they did not have this quality pulsing through their veins, and therefore they could not marry into Klal Yisrael. So what's Rus doing when she accompanies her mother-in-law? Because we all know that mother-in-laws are held up as the classic example of people that we always love. Right? Special bond between Rus and her mother-in-law. She's leaving her people to go to a people where she's not allowed to marry. That's a tremendous sacrifice. She's never going to have a family. She's never going to have a husband. She's going to be an outcast where she's going. It's bad enough to be an outcast, but to seek it out is quite a madrega. Yes?
She wasn't married before
But she was still a Moabite. So she was never going to be permitted to marry anyone who she was coming to.
So how she married him before he died?
I can't hear you, I'm sorry?
How she married him?
He broke the rule. That was he wasn't living with Bnei Yisrael anymore, he had left. But in any event, Rus is putting herself in an environment where she'll never be able to marry, never be able to have children, and really be an outcast for the rest of her life. Who does that? Rus had no idea that a change in the rule was going to be formulated, that the rule was Moavi velo Moavis, or Ammoni velo Ammonis. That it was only the males who couldn't marry him, but not the females. Now let's think about that for a second. What happened? Why didn't they know that part of the rule 100 years earlier or 50 years earlier? Where did that rule come from? How did Boaz come up with that rule? I'm sorry, go ahead. It came from Moshe. Tell me more.
That was the rule. That was the ruling.
So why did Boaz have to enunciate the ruling if that was always the rule?
It fell into disuse.
I'm sorry?
It was not a rule that they remembered.
So you're saying that was always the rule? Doesn't seem that way from the Megillah, but it's possible. It's possible Boaz knew this from his Rebbeim and had been passed down as part of Torah Shabbal Peh. I saw a different answer, and the answer that I saw is that, on the contrary, it was Rus demonstrating this amazing chesed for her mother-in-law, which indicated to Boaz the reasoning of the ruling. The ruling was only meant to apply when it was created out of a vacuum of chesed. There was no chesed among these people. They wouldn't offer food even to people that were passing through their land. Yet here we have a woman from this culture who's doing all this self-sacrifice. It was obvious that it wasn't the women of Moab who exemplified this midah of a vacuum of chesed. Rather, they were full of chesed. So the takana must have been Ammoni velo Ammonis, Moavi velo Moavis. But this idea of Rus, the idea that it was her act of chesed which changed the takana, or changed the interpretation of the rule, or reminded them of a rule that had been forgotten, is another principle of chesed, another side of the sphere to understand what chesed is. It's this idea that you have to understand, and we learn it in many Gemaras and other places, that when you do chesed, you're not diminished because of it. When you do chesed, it comes back to you tenfold. The rewards that you get for your chesed far exceed whatever it was that you gave up. And this takes me to one more story I want to share with you. This is a story that happened right here in Baltimore. Many of you may be familiar with the Beis Pessi. Beis Pessi is an apartment building just a few blocks from here, named after a young woman who died at a young age, and they wanted to perpetuate some chesed in her memory. So the community got together and bought an apartment building so that people who were here to visit Hopkins or other medical facilities had a place to stay. A place that was bekavadik and comfortable. and where they could stay at little or no charge. And it has, to this day, over the last 20 years, become a place where many people use when either their children or family members are having medical issues and they have to be here from another city. There was a man here from California, a very wealthy man, who was very happy to pay whatever the appropriate cost was to stay at Beis Pessi. He didn't need any help. But he was overwhelmed by the kindness that people did for him while he was there, to make sure that he had proper meals and that he was taken care of, and if he had rides, even though he was a wealthy man and could take care of his own needs, he was very blown away by the fact that people couldn't do enough for him first. And Baruch Hashem, he had a recovery while he was here, and he said to some of the people that ran Beis Pessi, you know, what you guys are doing here is an amazing thing. And if you ever need financial help for something, or, you know, I'm a person of means, call on me. Maybe I'll be able to help. About a year later, a young man from Israel had come here because he had a very rare form of cancer for which there was no treatment. He was 27 years old, had 3 young children, and his condition in Israel had been diagnosed as terminal. There was no treatment they could offer him. They did, however, tell him that there was an experimental protocol being tried in several different United States locations. It's a long shot, but for every 100 people that goes through these protocols, there's usually 1 or 2 who get some miraculous benefit. That's how they fine-tune the protocols until eventually it becomes a treatment. They're being offered at the Mayo Clinic, at Sloan Kettering, and here at Hopkins. These clinical trials, experimental treatments. He had nothing to lose. Only thing is he had to raise money to get the plane ticket. So he raised enough money over the course of the next few weeks to come to America. And he first went to the Mayo Clinic. And they told him that they do, in fact, have a clinical trial which matches his illness, but it's unfunded, which means it's a pay-your-own-way. And the cost was $60,000. He didn't have $1,000 for a plane ticket. He wasn't going to get $60,000, certainly not before this illness had taken his life. So he went to the Sloan Kettering facility next, or actually I think he called Sloan Kettering, and they told him that the clinical trial they had was over, and they didn't plan on starting another one. But there was one at Hopkins. So he came here to Baltimore. And he was informed similarly at Hopkins that they also have an experimental clinic which matches his illness, but again, it's unfunded. $55,000 to participate. He doesn't have $55,000. And quite demoralized, he went back to the Beis Pessi that night and began packing up his belongings to go home. And the people at Beis Pessi asked him what happened. He says, well, they need $55,000. And so he was going to go home to spend his last few months with his family. And they said, stay one more night. Maybe we can do something. And they called this man in California. And they told him the story. And he says, I'll be happy to send over a check with one condition. The recipient can never know where the money came from. We all know that when you do chesed, it's best to do it blindly. This man obviously felt very close to his heart that if he wanted to make this magnanimous gesture, he wanted it to be anonymous. And they said, well, it's a tremendous thing that you're offering to do. We will honor your wishes, by all means. And the check arrived next day by express mail. And this young man started his experimental treatment. And of the 250 people in the clinical trial, he was one of 6 that was cured. And after 6 weeks, he's in full remission. And he was beside himself with the news, obviously. And he came back to the Beis Pessi, and he was telling them the story. He says, I know you told me that the benefactor didn't want me to know who he was. But this gift of life that was given to me, how can I let it go without even expressing a thank you? I'm sorry, that was his wishes, though. That was the condition. He says, well, perhaps I can buy a small gift, a token of my appreciation, and you can give it to him. That would still preserve his anonymity. And they thought about this for a minute, and they said, that seems reasonable. So he went out and bought a beautiful sterling menorah and had engraved on it a pasuk referring to the kindness of helping someone recover from an illness as an expression of gratitude. And the people at Beis Pessi mailed it to his home in Los Angeles. And the gentleman returned back to Eretz Yisrael to be with his family. 2 days later, the package comes back because there was no one there to sign for the package. Well, they wanted to deliver this package somehow. They had a cell phone number for this man and for his wife. So they tried those numbers, and they got a hold of the wife. And the wife says, yeah, we're not in our home right now because my husband's in a big land development project. They have like 200 acres of property they're developing, and he's kind of living on site there for the next few months. And I'm out of town traveling because my husband's not home. So they asked her, well, perhaps you can give us the address of where your husband is at so we can send him this package. She said, I'd love to give you the address, but it doesn't have an address. It's 200 acres of undeveloped land. I can tell you what county it's in. I can even tell you how to get there, but an address it doesn't have. So they called up Federal Express, and they said, listen, this package you tried to deliver for us, we know where it's supposed to go, but we don't have an address. Can you deliver something if we give you directions? They said, if you give us directions, we'll get it there. We don't need an exact address. And it was one gravel road onto a dirt road and 3 turns through the woods and make a left at the second fire pole and all this kind of stuff. And sure enough, they come to an open, cleared area in the woods, a couple hundred acres, and there's several trailers set up and cranes and all kinds of stuff going on there. It's about 5:30 in the evening. And for those of you who don't know about construction, by 4 o'clock, most construction crews are shutting down because they usually start at about 6 o'clock in the morning. And it's pretty much a ghost town by the time the FedEx driver gets there, but he notices that one of the trailers has a light on in it, with a door open with just a screen door. So he goes up to that trailer and he knocks on the door. Nobody answers. Knocks again. Nobody answers. He looks inside the screen to see if he can see anything, and he sees a pair of legs lying on the ground. So he goes inside and he sees a man unconscious on the floor. Calls 911. They take him to a hospital. The man had had a serious heart attack, but they were able to revive him. He was going to recover. He was going to be okay. And he woke up in the hospital, and there's a menorah next to his bed. And he looks at this menorah. He says, where is this from? He goes, that's what saved your life. This package was delivered by a FedEx driver, and he's the one who discovered you lying on the floor unconscious. And he realized then that the $55,000 check that he had written was to save his own life. It was that act of chesed which brought that menorah and the delivery man to find him and bring him to the hospital. That's the lesson of Rus. We can explore this sphere, this cubicle of chesed in many ways. But every time we discover another side of it, we understand it a little bit better. That sometimes the Gemara tries to explain it as when you give chesed, it can be returned to you tenfold. What does that mean? Does that mean you give $100, you get $1,000 back? Maybe. Maybe what it means is what happened to this gentleman. When you're trying to do a chesed, you don't realize that chesed may come back to you in a form you weren't expecting and never could have contemplated. It's another side of the sphere. The life you say may be your own. There's someone who had that expression somewhere sometime. The last thing I want to go into, the last part of our discussion, is the 2 Gemaras that I have on the last page of your source sheet. The first one is a Gemara in Chagiga. I could have given you 20 Gemaras which say similar things. I picked these 2. This Gemara in Chagiga, if you start 4 lines from the top, I don't know if you want to follow along or not, the line starts with the word Pesach. In the middle of the page, 4 lines from where the Gemara section starts in the middle. For those of you, it's this section over here is the Gemara. It's the 4th line down. And Gemara is talking about 20 different arguments that Rabbi Yochanan had with Reish Lakish. They were good friends, but they agreed on nothing. And that's what they spent most of their time doing, was arguing over minute points of halacha and Torah. And then the Gemara says, well, you should just know, there were some things they agreed on. So the Gemara goes out of their way to say, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish to Amri Tervaihu. They both said the same thing. A proclamation. They both said the same thing. Bizman shebeis hamikdash kayim, mizbeach mechaper al adam. Karbanos that we brought us kapara and forgiveness. Achshav, now that there's no beis hamikdash, shulchano shel adam mechaper alav. It's his table that brings him forgiveness. And if you look at the top Rashi on the page, for those of you who are unfamiliar, it's this corner over here is the Rashi. And the top line says, Shulchanu mechaper alav. What does it mean? His table grants him a forgiveness? Rashi just says 2 words. His table means b'achnosas archim, by having guests at his table. And they interpret this from the Gemara that says, begins a few lines before this. It says, Elu zeh hashulchan asher lifnei Pesach mizbeach v'siyam b'shulchan. The pasuk starts with the word mizbeach and it ends with the word shulchan, talking about the same thing. So the Gemara learns from there that a person's shulchan mirrors the mizbeach. And Rashi explains to us that when it says shulchan, it means hachnasas archim. Can you imagine having guests at your table is equal to bringing karbanos in the Beis Hamikdash? Where's that parallel come from? Okay, table, I get it. But where's the parallel? How is one comparable to another? So let me ask you a question. Do you think when they brought karbanos in the Beis Hamikdash, there was a big party in Shemayim? Hey, karbanos are coming! Malachim, come around! Big stuff being brought up from the other world. They couldn't care less. They didn't need the karbanos. It did nothing for Hashem. It did nothing for the Malachim. What did it do? It was symbolic of the fact that we were giving from what we had to Hashem. It's a recognition that what we have comes from Hashem. We're just custodians of it, temporarily. That's Shulchan. Whatever we have here is ours to share. It's not ours to keep because it doesn't even belong to us. That's the comparable part of the Mizbeach to the Shulchan. The Mizbeach was the ultimate symbol of giving from what we have in recognition that it all comes from Hashem. And that's Shulchano. That's Hachnasas Archim, according to Rashi. To understanding that whatever you have is yours to share. It's not yours. It's not yours. And from that I want to go into one of the last stories we're going to talk about. There's a famous brothers called the Strauss brothers. I don't know if any of you ever heard of them, who founded the Macy's chain of department stores. Strauss brothers were Jewish boys, had chesed pulsing through their veins. And they were very philanthropic. They did a lot to help Jews and to help non-Jews. One of their great things that they were known for during the war, in the beginning of the 20th century, was they championed the cause of pasteurized milk and homogenized milk, which cured many illnesses, prevented many illnesses, and was generally much healthier for people. But it was still a costly process at that time and wasn't in vogue and wasn't regulated and wasn't required. They championed this cause and opened up free milk places for anyone where they could come, and get pasteurized and homogenized milk. Now, granted, they were wealthy people, made lots of money, but this was a cause they believed in. It helped children in particular, and it became a big quest of theirs. Well, the Strausses became enamored with the cause of the State of Israel in the late 1940s. And they traveled to Israel to find out what was this all about, this State of Israel thing, and to see what they could do. They traveled there with their wives. And they were there for 6 months, doing all types of philanthropy. As a matter of fact, the town of Netanya is named after Nathan Strauss. He provided the seed money to get that settlement started, which is now the thriving city of Netanya. The Strauss brothers were there for 6 months, and then one of them decided it was time to go home. They were originally only going there for 6 months. And the other one was so enthralled with what he had seen and what had been accomplished and what still needed to be done that he decided to stay. And a little historical fact, the brother who went back took a ride on a luxury cruise ship, as was appropriate for him, someone of his means, and that luxury cruise ship that he sailed on was the Titanic, and he did not survive. The brother who decided to remain in Israel to complete more chesed was the one who survived, and he did a tremendous amount of chesed for the rest of his life, involving many causes in the State of Israel. And to that I want to take you to this last Gemara in Shabbos. It's at the bottom of your last source sheet. There's multiple lines I would refer you to here. I'll try to show you where they are, but the first one is on the 4th line. It says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Gedol haknasas archim kishashkamas beis hamedrash. It's more important to do chesed than it is to go to shul or to go learn in the study hall. Really? How's that? What element of chesed are they trying to teach us there? And go down about halfway down, and it says on the 6th line, Amar Rav, Gedola hachnasas arkim me'akabolas pnei shchina. It's even greater than greeting God himself. Imagine, God comes knocking on your door and says, hey, I'm God. I'd like to talk to you. God, I'd really like to talk to you. So much I could learn from you, but I have these guests over right now. Can I talk to you later? Really? Is that what the Gemara is telling us? Yes. Read on. We learn it from a pasuk. When Avram said to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Imna machtzasi chen beinecha al no tavar. Please wait for me, because I'm tending to my guests right now. When he had the 3 men over, and Hashem came to greet him, and he put Hashem on hold to take care of his guests. Yeah, that's what they're telling us. That's greater than meeting God himself. That's got to cry out for explanation. What are we trying to learn here? And then you go down from the 4th line from the bottom. There's 6 things. Shisha devarim adam ochel peroseim ba'olam hazeh. There's 6 things for which we enjoy the fruits of our labors here in this world. V'hakeren kayemes l'olam haba. But the principle stays intact to us get reward for it in olam haba. Most things it's either or it's part here, part there. But there's 6 things you can do where you get paid for it here and there. Ve'elu heim, and this is what they are. Hachnasas archim, ubikur cholim, v'iyun tefillah v'hashkamas beis medrash, to go to the beis medrash and learn. V'amigdal banav, and to raise children, and Talmud Torah, and to learn Torah. I mean, there's so many different angles to what we're talking about here, but the one common denominator we get here is the hachnasas archim and the bikur cholim. These are things for which the reward is unquantifiable, because it's here and the principle remains intact for olam haba. Greater than meeting Hashem. How can that be? What could be greater than meeting Hashem and learning from Him directly all He has to teach us that we try to learn from Torah? What could be greater than that? How is Hachnosis Archim greater than that? What was Avraham thinking? And the Gemara goes on to say that you understand now how the Midas HaKadosh Baruch Hu are different. Hashem was delighted to be put on hold so that Avram could tend to his guests. And it goes back to this, what we talked about at the beginning. This idea that the Big Bang was the explosion of God's goodness. We are Hashem's children. He created us in His image. Most parents want for their children to, at least to an extent, emulate their behavior, to emulate their midos, to somehow have learned from what they are. What gives a parent greater enjoyment? The fact that a child says to them, I've heard what you've taught me over the years. Or to have someone else tell them that their child is just like you. They do things just like you do. Is it more rewarding to hear that a child has incorporated the lessons into who they are and is acting that way? Or is it more rewarding to hear the child say, I've heard? It's obviously more rewarding to watch the behavior itself. When Hashem sees Avram Avinu wanting to do chesed as opposed to meeting him, He's telling Hashem that, yes, I've heard, but it's part of who I am now. I've learned not only to listen, but to do what you do. A few months ago, there was a scientific discovery of Higgs boson. Anybody ever heard of Higgs boson? A couple people here, right? Higgs boson is what they call the God particle. They've been studying this scientifically for decades, trying to break down something beneath the atom to a smaller level to understand this one particle, because we all know that the atom and molecules don't explain anything. Higgs boson, for those who don't understand, explains the difference between the massless photon, which mediates electromagnetism, and the massive W and Z bosons, which mediate the weak force. Now I get it! That's what Higgs boson was all about. There was this one part of science they couldn't figure out, of how the atoms and molecules functioned with each other, how they originated. Well, they've got that now. They've been searching it for years because they figured it must exist. Because otherwise there's no way to explain the difference between the massless photons, which mediate the electromagnetism, and the massive W and Z bosons, which mediate the weak force. Now we get it. Chesed is our Higgs boson. It's always been here. We've always had it. Whether it's from Rachel, whether it's from Abraham, no matter where it is. Chesed is the Higgs boson of our world. The world was created from that mass explosion of Chesed that couldn't be contained. Chesed is what Hashem wants to see us doing because it's how He created the world and how everything in it came to be. Chesed is our Higgs boson. So why Avram Avinu? After all these different things which we've explored, why Avram Avinu is the paramount example of Chesed? So I'll offer you this one suggestion. Rachel, Noach, Lot, Rivka, Rus, all examples which teach us very profound things. But there's one significant difference. They were all examples that when opportunity knocked, they answered. They were there when the call came. Avram Avinu told Hashem to send him guests. Hashem had made it a hot sun that day, so no one would come to protect Avram so he could recover. Avram was the only person who we saw who was in pain because he didn't have the opportunity. That's the difference. We can talk about atoms and molecules with Rivka and Noach and Lot, but the Higgs boson is about understanding that that's why we are here. And every minute we are here that we're not doing that, we're missing something. We're missing an opportunity. That's that molecule they've been looking for 45 years. Yeah, we understand how the atoms work and how the molecules work. We understand about going the extra mile. We understand about having guests. We understand about doing good things. But do we understand that every moment that we don't have the opportunity, that we don't create an opportunity, is lost? It's a lost chance. And with that, I'll conclude with one last story. Because the fact of the matter is we can talk about it on a conceptual level about a missed opportunity, but incorporate it into what it means. Every day, every moment, there is a chance for an act of kindness which can literally change the world. You think that's hyperbole? It's not. One act of chesed can change the world. One Rebbe who I was very close with in Eretz Yisrael, he's now well into his 80s, got a long white beard, was at our house a year or so ago, comes every few years now. He was a modern American Jew, growing up in the 5 towns in New York as a teenager. And he was on the fast track to nowhere, let's just say that. And his father, an old European Jew, Holocaust survivor, said to him, "You know what, Usher, I'm putting you on a train and sending you to Telz. You're 18 years old. If it doesn't take for you there, I'm done. You're on your own." Telz, in my jeans and, bought him a bus ticket, went to Telz, opens the door to the building, goes inside, looks inside the base medrash. Everyone's wearing black pants and white shirts. Says, "This is never going to happen." So he turns around and starts walking down the hallway to leave. And a young man comes up to him and says, "Hello, are you new here?" "No, I'm just passing through." "Well, we're about to have lunch. You want to join us for lunch?" "I haven't eaten in several hours." "That seems like a nice thing to do." So as Rav Usher told me, I sat down for lunch with them, and I stayed for 17 years. This man, who's now been a Rosh Hashiva in Eretz Yisrael for 45 years, has had thousands and thousands of Talmidim because one person asked him if he wanted to stay and have lunch. A girl who's having all types of self-esteem issues looks at herself in the mirror every day, wondering if she's passable to go outside. And someone asks her, "Did you put on a few pounds?" Can you imagine the damage that does to somebody for months, years? How hard is it to say something nice to somebody? Because the opposite is also true. One nice comment goes a very long way. It's our Higgs boson. It's how all these different stories of Chesed connect to each other. It's the base molecule. It pulses through our veins, as long as we don't turn it off. But understand that every moment of every day we have the ability to change the world. Thank you very much.